Hello everyone, welcome to this week's video. We'll start off with a word of congratulations and thank you to the subscribers to my little YouTube channel here. Well, I guess it's not so little now. I didn't imagine that I would get this level of support from you all on the videos that I've uploaded. So thank you very much for making your opinions and perspectives heard on this channel, and keep them coming. Up to 360 subscribers now. So yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And I wanted to get that established in the name of getting the important stuff sorted first. So once again, thank you all to my subscribers and people who have commented on my videos. And like I said, keep it coming. That's how we all get better. As the old military saying goes, steel sharpens steel, right? So with that, we'll jump right into the subject at hand, and that is HobbyMaster's A-4B Skyhawk. This airplane apparently has more names than Paul Atreides from the Dune series. This thing is called the Scooter, Heineman's Hot Rod, Skyhawk, Mongoose. There's probably one or two that I'm not mentioning or have forgotten, but this airplane has more aliases than James Bond has STDs. I mean, this thing has a lot of names, and there are reasons why. This airplane is apparently very, very maneuverable. I do remember seeing one of the YouTube videos showing one of these A4s, which I believe was an A4C, so somewhat different, but not in terms of what counts in terms of performance. And the pilot in the question rang that thing out like nobody's business, and it was rolling. I mean, the thing was rolling like 4 or 5 times a second with 2 drop tanks attached, and I've never seen an airplane do that. Usually when an aircraft is flown at a demo, if it has drop tanks on it, it's not doing very many acrobatic stuff, and apparently that was not the case. So big shout out to Dollarhide for posting that video, because seeing this thing in action like that is just, it's crazy. It really does put some credibility behind the names this airplane had. And if that, in combination with how the A4 mod and DCS flies, is any indication, this thing is a hot rod. So, and as it so happens, that's one of the names of this airplane, Heineman's Hot Rod, which is a good transition into talking about how this airplane came to be. Basically, in 1954, the U.S. Navy sought a replacement for their fleet of A-1D Sky Raiders, which was another Heineman engineered project. So originally, the U.S. Navy had specified a design weighing about 48,000 pounds, carrying more of a payload than the B-17. Heineman, crazy genius that he was, figured he had a way of meeting the Navy's requirements in an airplane that was half the size. And when the A4 Skyhawk debuted in 1954, it actually set a speed record of 654 miles an hour, which is pretty impressive for an airplane designed in paper to haul bombs. We'll get to why I say on paper a little later in today's video. So the A4 was quickly adopted by the U.S. Navy, and it went on to have a very long career. As a matter of fact, this airplane to this day in 2022 is still in service with the Brazilian Navy and the Argentinian Air Force. So those are the military operators who still use the A4. Then you have the private companies such as Top Aces, Draken, and so forth, who do contract red air, and they have bought quite a few surplus A4s from countries which used to operate them, like Singapore, New Zealand, and Israel, which is a great transition into this airplane's very illustrious service in the militaries of the world. Originally, it started in Vietnam. Many of you are well aware that this airplane served in Vietnam, but it had a very strong role in that conflict. This was the first U.S. Navy airplane to drop bombs on Vietnam once that conflict started during Operation, let me look at my notes here, because there's quite a few operations involved with the Vietnam War, and you know, you can have a pretty healthy debate with people to figure out when that conflict started, because you can define it as when Kennedy escalated, when Lyndon Johnson escalated. I mean, there's really no defined point when the Vietnam War really started. I mean, you could use the point the Marines just walked on the beach at Da Nang, but again, it's just up to personal preference, I suppose, as to when you want to define the start of that conflict. But essentially, in the first airstrike, which was called Operation Pierce Arrow, A-4s participated and dropped bombs on North Vietnam. This was, of course, during that very flawed gradualism plan, which was intended to essentially bomb North Vietnam to the peace table, which Nixon only marginally pulled off a decade after this. Back to the A-4. This airplane went on to serve in Southeast Asia in many capacities, and of course there's no hard and fast way to know for sure, but an A-4 might well have been the last U.S. airplane to drop a bomb in Vietnam. The credited aircraft in question was a U.S. Marine Corps A-4, which was used as a close air support platform up into the final days of the Vietnam conflict. So this aircraft participated quite a bit in that war. It has a reversion system, so many of you that are familiar with the A-10 know that the pilot has the option to disconnect the hydraulics and just fly off of manual controls. This is in case any part of the airplane is damaged in battle. If the hydraulic lines are severed and it leaks leaks hydraulic fluid, the airplane controls will not work unless you have a cable-driven system, which is pretty much how airplanes have always been flown before the era of hydraulically boosted controls. So with that in mind, if and when an A-4 pilot had battle damage and suffered a hydraulic leak, they could change over to the backup manual system. And while it wouldn't necessarily give them full control of the airplane as one would have in the event of a fully functional hydraulic system, it would be enough to control the airplane so they could get out of Dodge, position the airplane to either do an emergency landing, ideally, or if an emergency landing isn't possible, they can get to someplace friendly and eject over safer territory, which happened apparently quite a bit in some of the source material I read on this aircraft's participation in the Vietnam conflict. Many damaged A-4s that were hit or nearly hit by AAA and SAMs, the pilot was able to flip a switch, get it to manual reversion control, I should say, and get their stricken A-4 either back to the carrier or to a land base that's friendly, or if all else failed, get to some friendly position near a destroyer or other ship where they could get picked up by search and rescue right away. So that feature, of course, is now used in the modern A-10 and has been used by many pilots to get themselves out of trouble in combat, one of whom is Kim Casey, a killer chick. And she's a colonel in the U.S. Air Force, retired, and I believe Ward Carroll just uploaded a video of her story on how she was able to get her wounded A-10 out of Baghdad using such a system. So the A-4, despite being a very simple airplane, was very survivable, and it had a rather simple construction. If you notice here, you have the landing gear on the outside. This is because the wing was one long spar through the internal frame of the aircraft, which meant because of the small size of the airplane, you did not need to have folding wings. Without folding wings, you didn't need the hydraulic assemblies, wing fold mechanism, and other associated gear, which added weight and dimension to the airplane. Heinemann's calculation showed that for every pound you added to an airplane, you needed 10 pounds of supporting airframe to move that extra weight, meaning if you have a heavier wing, you need a bigger engine. To have a bigger engine, you need to burn more fuel, which burns more fuel, which means you need bigger fuel tanks, which adds weight to the airplane, and the cycle just gets vicious, right? So Heinemann's philosophy was to cut as much off of the airplane as possible, and he helped do that by getting rid of the wing fold, getting rid of external or internal landing gear configurations. He got rid of just about everything on this airplane that you didn't need to fly it with. And I dare say it was a very successful effort. So It went on to not only shine in Vietnam, the A-4 also did an excellent job in the various Middle Eastern wars of the 20th century, including the 1973 Yom Kippur conflict, where Israel was surprise attacked by an Arab coalition. During that conflict, the A-4s provided round-the-clock close air support during a time period when it was very dangerous because they didn't have exposure to the then brand new SA-6 surface-to-air missile system, and the survival of the nation of Israel was on the line. So the lightweight, the serviceability, the reliability, and the ease of use, plus the manual reversion capability of the controls, was very much appreciated by the Israelis, who continue to fly the A-4 all the way up until 2015. So that, if you're counting, is 49 years of service since the airplane was first introduced. So yeah, and of course in the U.S., just because the Vietnam War ended, it didn't end the story for the A-4. The A-4 would go on to have a long career as a training aircraft for pilots learning to fly tactical fighters in the Navy. It would also move on to being an aggressor. Now, this is a role that I'll explain for those who aren't necessarily aware. Being an aggressor means that it's a friendly airplane, but it's flown in a way that mimics enemy tactics and enemy capabilities to train pilots to fly airplanes that are dissimilar to themselves. And the A-4 took on that role in stepping into the same general performance parameters of the MiG-17. So back in the Cold War, one did not just snap their fingers and buy a MiG on eBay. Back then, getting a hold of a MiG was a very, very difficult proposition for a Western country. So Western countries like the US and NATO allies needed a simulation that could approximate a MiG in terms of performance, so that our pilots knew what to do if they ever encountered one in the field of battle against the Soviet Union, which was the main threat of the time. So the A-4 was used as an aggressor, and it's in this role that it starred in a certain movie involving a guy named Tom Cruise back in the 1980s. Some of you may have heard of that movie, but all jokes aside, the A-4 had a very distinguished role in that capacity as a aggressor airplane. And yes, quite a few experienced Tomcat and later on Hornet and Super Hornet pilots would come to respect the A-4 for what it could do, because while it didn't have a lot of power, if one got into a close range fight with an A-4 in an F-14 or a Hornet or a Super Hornet, they very well could lose. So back to a certain saying from a different movie that recently came out, it's not the plane, it's the pilot. So the A-4 served as a very good aggressor in the U.S. military up until its final retirement in 2008. However, as I said earlier, the A-4 is still to this day used by multiple private companies because of its lightweight, ease of maintenance, maneuverability, and its low cost of operation. So these are still being flown today by many private companies in the aggressor role, which I think is kind of a meta thing, really, since like naval aviators in general who fly and earn a career and then one day they leave the military and they go into the private sector. Well, the A-4 kind of did the same thing as an airplane. It left the U.S. military and now it's totally private sector. So it's nice to see some of these. If you want to go on YouTube and see other A-4 videos, there's quite a few more recent videos of Draken and Top Aces A-4s doing their thing. There's also a really good video from one of the YouTube channels that does aerial photography. I don't want to quote his name because I'll probably get it wrong, but essentially he's got some footage of mini airplanes and he's got insider footage of one of the contract aggressors and how they maintain their A-4s. And it's a really good video. If you like this airplane a lot, go check it out to learn a little bit more about the how they maintain them and some of the modifications they do. And I think the ones they have, there's an avionics hump on their later versions, and they put batteries up here to do a self-start capability, which is kind of cool. A-4s did not normally have that. A-4s of this generation definitely didn't have it. You needed to use an external start cart to turn the airplane on. So that was kind of creative, and I like seeing that. So with that all established, we can move right into the model in question. This is obviously a HobbyMaster rendition of it. I did modify this a little bit. So if you're wondering what some of the blue stuff is over here and over there, those are all elements of blue tack that I've used, because these missiles are not from this airplane or from the arms kit that comes with it. In the box, you get 3 sets of external fuel tanks and a pair of rockets and a pair of Shrikes. Excuse me, actually not Shrikes. They're Shrikes. I was going to say Walleye, but they're Shrike missiles, which are the missiles that you launch for radar homing, a very primitive radar homing system, which primitive though I say that, it was the best they could come up with back in the 60s. In any event, the A4s utilized multiple weapons. I would have liked to see with this HobbyMaster release some more variety of what they could carry, like a TER or a triple ejection rail in the middle for having 3 bombs, or having bombs on the outside, and having option for air-to-air missiles, since the A4 did do the air superiority role for a time for the U.S. Navy. Back in the 60s, the U.S. Navy still operated what were called escort carriers, and these carriers were World War II leftovers. So these ships still had utility, but they were too small to accommodate the then latest generation of tactical airplanes like the F-4 Phantom and the F-8 Crusader. So to still put these ships to some military use, the U.S. Navy assigned them the role of anti-submarine escort carriers, which is all well and good because they could put all the airplanes that didn't need a big carrier deck onto these smaller, more affordable, somewhat surplus but not surplus carriers. And what they found out though was, well, when you have a ship that's full of anti-submarine helicopters, S-1 trackers, which are propeller engine predecessors to the modern day Hawkeyes and C2s, as well as the A-1 Sky Raiders and then the A-4s, all these airplanes could take off and land from these smaller carriers without a problem. However, none of the fighters that the Navy had could operate from these ships. So what they did is they took a batch of A4s, bolted on some sidewinders, which were intended for self-defense, and then gave them the assignment of combat air patrol. So for a time, these A4s were doing air superiority, and I dare say they probably would have done a pretty good job if the history of the airplane as an aggressor platform is any indication. So interestingly enough, the A4, as an enduring example of don't just trust the designation, did a lot more than just attack stuff. It was a very versatile multi-role setup before we really came up with the idea of multi-role systems. So back to the model at hand, HobbyMaster, I think, did a good job with the color, and it's obviously one of their earlier releases, so they did do a little bit of weathering and panel line painting, which I thought is really well done. That's unusual. I'm usually not a fan of that with models, but HobbyMaster did a good job with this, so I don't have a query about it. There is one area of I guess you might say a criticism, and that's just the canopy, which is something that almost all HobbyMaster A4s are incorrect in some way. This is the A-4B, so the canopy right here is more reflective of what you would see on like a later model A4E or F, which has the bigger bubble, and you would see on something like the Israeli A4s or the upgraded Argentinian ones. So the earlier version, the A4Bs and Cs, had a much smaller cockpit. There's kind of a shelf right here where it's it's like a higher, I don't want to say, like a higher sill, if you will, to the canopy on those earlier versions, which is not accurately modeled here. And unfortunately, on the later version, they revised the canopy, but they still didn't really get the look right. So that's something hopefully HobbyMaster can take away and refine in later releases. They did do a good job showing the Colt 20mm cannons right here and right here. And the overall detail of the wings and the slats look pretty good. Again, I would have liked to see some more variety in terms of air-to-air or air-to-ground weaponry too, but that's why I got blue tack and a couple of AIM-9Bs bolted on right now. So, I mean, adapt and overcome, right? So, I would say if you can get a hold of this, definitely pick it up. I paid about $140 on eBay for this, and it was quite the odyssey getting this model here. The seller had actually crossed my order with someone else's, so they sent this airplane to some poor guy in Delaware, and I got like his some measuring equipment, like some stud finder or something like that, which I knew there was problems as soon as I turned the key from my mailbox drop, and then I saw the package was like the size of a cigarette box, a really long cigarette box. I was like, oh, this isn't good. I looked at the tracking number, verified that was the package that the seller sent me, and I was like, yeah, this is definitely not a HobbyMaster box. So we were able to sort that out. The seller was able to get in touch with the other guy who had this model, who had my airplane, and we were able to work out a deal where the seller had generated 2 new shipping labels. He put the model in the mail, I put his stud finder in the mail here, and then 14 days after I punched in the order, I did get my aircraft. So the seller did credit my account, so I'm not too perturbed about that. I mean, stuff happens, but still, it's frustrating because this is not a release that is very easy to find now. It's still out there, but they're not necessarily common. And it's one of those models that HobbyMaster doesn't release a lot of. So if you do see an A4 that you like, jump on it, because these things don't get cheaper with time, especially lately. Thank you for watching the video to this point. I definitely, again, appreciate your support and patronage of my channel. So take a look around at my other videos. I invite you to see what other parts of my collection that you might find appealing. All the models on my channel are mine. They are not sponsored or donated. So the opinions that you hear are mine. They're not sponsored content or anything of the sort. So once again, thank you for your patronage and your time. Consider subscribing if you like my videos. That way you'll know when I release my next one right away. And have a good one.